It's my pleasure to introduce John Miller Stephanie, the producing artistic director at the Rep, who came to us, thankfully, from the Guthrie in Minneapolis. The Clinton School and the Rep have a great relationship. This is, for those of you that come to these programs, you know, but this is our 36th program with the Rep that began in 2010. And I must say, this play, which has been described as somewhere between Shakespeare and reality TV, and somewhere between class and crass, The School for Lies. I'm very excited in investing with the cast over lunch. You're in for a treat. Please welcome John Miller Stephanie.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. We have a tremendously gifted group of theater artists here with us. The School for Lies is, I think, quite different than anything that's been done at the Rep in recent years. When I was first thinking about this season and thinking about the balance of this season, I noted that in years past, my predecessor tended to program a Shakespeare just about every other year. And in past years, they've been serious. They've been the Scottish play, Macbeth, or Hamlet, or Henry V. And I thought, really, I think we need to do a comedy in my first year. And I think a Shakespeare comedy is a good idea. But then I realized, looking down the list of past productions, I didn't see initially any Moliere. And Moliere is perhaps the most celebrated comic playwright next to Shakespeare in terms of the Western canon. And I thought, how odd that the Rep has never done. Well, subsequently, I was somebody rapped me on my hand and said, well, no, many years ago there was a production of Scepan, which is, or Scapino, which is based on Scepan. But certainly it was unusual in terms of past years. So I reached out to Giovanna Sardelli, our director, and we were talking about perhaps working together on a Moliere. And first we thought about doing Tartuffe, and in a translation by Richard Wilbur. And that was interesting, an interesting idea. Richard Wilbur is sort of the gold standard for English translations of Moliere. But then we decided to look at this newer version of Misanthrope called School for Lies. So that's how we ended up here. I'd like, actually, rather than me going on, why don't we have each of you introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Sean Fagan, and I play Orant, one of the fops in the play.
I'm going to use the microphone. I am Patrick Halley. I also play one of the fops, a rich, stupid marquis named Accost.
And I'm Mark Leiter. I play fop number 3, richer and stupider than the other two.
I'm Corrine. I play the female fop, kind of, or antagonist, Arsinoe.
And I'm Giovanna Sardelli. I'm the director. I'm my own fop, actually.
So, Giovanna, why don't you tell us a little bit about our early conversations and the pros and cons of the more staid, traditional Richard Wilbur translations of Moliere and this crazy new version?
Yes.
And there's a mic right there for you.
Yes, I will use the mic. How many of you are familiar with Tartuffe? Well, that's fine if you are not. So I am not a Moliere scholar. I was trained as an actress, and it is mandatory that you do some Moliere in school because you have to learn to handle the language and the comedy, so it's wonderful training. But when I was asked which I would prefer, David Ives' version of School for Lies or Moliere, I read both, and I'm while I am a fan of Moliere, there was something about it that David Ives has tapped into something that's immediate and accessible in a way that I think serves us right now. He's also a living playwright, and my specialty is in working with living playwrights, so I also liked that. And I liked that the script was also in flux because he did a production recently in Washington, and so he actually went back, looked at the script, and made some calculated changes and updates to make it even more current than it was when we first looked at it. And so I loved that he was honoring Moliere, he was respectful of Moliere, and yet he is writing for right now as well.
So there's this juxtaposition between, it takes place more or less, kind of, sort of, in 1666. And then, so you have this, you can see the set, Robert Mark Morgan designed our set. It's fantastic. So it's very evocative of, mid-17th century. And then Rafael Castanara, who is our resident costume designer and production manager, designed the clothes, also more than a nod to the period. I think the wigs should have their own curtain call, really. So the physical production is really very much in keeping with the period in which the play was originally written. But then you have the language, and I'm wondering if some of the actors want to talk about the contemporary language. Anyone want to jump in?
Sure. It is in keeping of the spirit of Moliere in that the play is written in verse. And in the spirit of Shakespeare, the play is in iambic pentameter, and it is in rhyming couplets. What is wonderful is, while in terms of its style and its structure, it is sort of a nod to the history and genre, the actual text and the language and the words are about as contemporary as can be, and it's some of the rhymes are just brilliant, I think. So it's irreverent and contemporary, and there's some pop culture references which are snuck in there too. So it's sort of a wonderful hybrid of old style and contemporary text that I think just works quite well.
Now, oh, sorry.
You know when someone tells you a dirty limerick, and you wait for the last line because you know that's going to be the thing that's really funny. It's going to tie the whole rhyme scheme together, that last line. That's throughout this play because it's told in these rhyming couplets. And so part of what's so fun for us, and I think for the audience, is to see how the playwright is going to resolve the rhyme that he sets up. You can tell, okay, that's the end of the line. What's going to be the word that rhymes with that? And that's part of the artistry of what he's done and what we get to relish when we hear it come flying off the stage.
Now, Sean, you've been in two other productions of, two productions of Misanthrope.
That's true.
Yeah, and those were the Richard Wilbur. So Richard Wilbur, an American poet, renowned for his more or less faithful adaptations of Moliere, and both of the Misanthropes you performed in were Richard Wilbur?
That's true.
What's the difference between Richard Wilbur and David Ives?
Well, I'll use the microphone. So one of the main differences is David Ives has taken some liberties with the plot. And in the original, there are some plot elements, some events, some plot devices that are a little bit hard for a contemporary audience, I think, to swallow, especially in the realm of gender relations. This happens a lot in Shakespeare, too, where you get to the end of a play in the fifth act and you're like, wait, she's going to marry him? Like, what? How is that happening? And so David Ives has excised some of those plot elements, I think, to make it a little bit more relatable to a contemporary audience, and also to position the central female character in a way that I think Moliere was intending, but the conventions of the time make it a little difficult for that to fully come to fruition. So Richard Wilbur's language, I think, is actually quite playful and pretty approachable. Mm-hmm. It's a little denser in terms of David Ives has also taken out some sort of thorny, complicated arguments that don't really further the plot and really aren't that funny. And Mr. Ives has sort of streamlined the plot in that way. So I would say those are the main differences. I highly recommend the Wilbur translations. They're absolutely delightful, but it's a long night in the theater.
Yeah.
This really moves along and gets you to the bar quick.
Right. Right. David Ives, who adapted Misanthrope and became School for Lies, he wrote a very interesting article where he said he really didn't even like Moliere very much before he started working on this. He was a big Shakespeare fan, and he had a hard time getting through, in some ways, the Misanthrope, because he couldn't really figure the end of Misanthrope is very open-ended, right? I mean, it's not tied up neatly. And I think Ives decided to go, I think, more down the Shakespeare route in terms of, tying, and there's a couple of devices in the play that are actually stolen right from Shakespeare, in terms of, I'm not going to give the ending away, but there's a surprise that seems very Shakespearean, and there's a sequence where, once again, stolen, if you're going to steal, you should steal from the best, right? So he stole from Shakespeare the idea of a mock courting someone to great comic effect in this play. So I know we have a couple of people on this panel who are singers. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the musicality of the language in terms of, it's almost, there's a lyricism to it that has its own kind of music. Does anyone want to? I'm looking at you, Mark.
Yeah, we were all looking for you.
Yes.
Mark's a very strong singer as well as a wonderful actor.
I think part of what's really terrific and what Giovanna should be credited in terms of the casting of the play is particularly, I think, the fops, who are very much part of the world that's being made fun of, this sort of overblown, over-the-top world, is that vocally, I think the three of us kind of live in a world, and I think probably Arsinoe too, that is very highbrow and very musical, and you hear lots of interesting sort of vocal flourishes as we speak and as we're delivering our lines, and lots of sort of traditional text, things that you do when you work with elevated text, where you lift the end of a line and you sort of serve it up in a way that makes it sound like you're doing classical text. And the actor playing Frank, who is the character that comes in and kind of blows through the whole world, has a very different delivery. You know what I mean? It's a different sounding voice. It's a different delivery. He approaches everything in a totally different way. And so I think his sense of music is very different, and it seems right for the character that he's playing in a different orchestra than the rest of them. I mean, he's playing in a rock band, and we're in a string quartet. You know what I mean? And so and there is that sense, I think, that when the audience sees that, I think you might not know what it is, but you'll hear it when you hear it. You'll know it when you hear it.
Working with Giovanna has been a real joy. We've never worked together before. And one of the acid tests as a producer in working with a guest director is the casting process. Because sometimes it can be tension-filled, I would say. Sometimes the casting process. And what was really refreshing about working with Giovanna is we had actually very similar tastes. So Giovanna, would you talk a little bit about the challenges of casting a production with elevated language or poetic language and what that means?
I don't know if you've heard the adage that, success of a production is 90% casting. And as a director, I hate that. But it's true, it really is. If you cast a show well, your process is easier and it's more playful and more fun. And while I am not a singer, I was trained by, I think, one of the greatest speech teachers in America. How many of you saw Forrest Gump? So, do you remember? You may not remember, but there's a moment at the end where Forrest Gump is sad and he's sitting on a park bench and he runs into an old lady and he doesn't know what to do with his life, and she turns to him and she says, "Why, Forrest, you must run. Run, Forrest, run." And she got the part because the director said, "My God, I have never heard the word run said in 2 syllables." And she was my teacher. And so we learned, when I first, in class, you would say something like, "This is a magnificent morning." And she would say, "A what?" And I thought she was deaf, so I would yell, "Magnificent!" And it took me years to realize she was saying, it's not any morning. By God, it is a magnificent morning. How are you using language? So I'm a bit of a snob. And you can feel when somebody walks in and language kind of lays there, it needs help. And every one of the actors who auditioned was able to elevate it and to play with language and use it to great effect for comedy. And also, how do you emote through elevated language? Because there's a poetic form that you have to honor. But within that, you still have to be a human. You still have to drive plot. You have to drive relationship. And so we were really looking for people who could do all of that. Somebody that would make Nora Dunphy proud. Proud.
Right. There's this belief, I think, amongst American actors, some American actors, that they don't trust the words. They act around the words rather than using the words. And I think, when you're doing Shakespeare, that's deadly. I've heard it said from many actors that learning texts like this is easier, and learning Shakespeare is easier than some contemporary text. Anyone want to talk about that? Why that might be? Is it true? Do you find that to be true, and why?
I find it to be true. I think mainly because you have a constant feedback mechanism of whether or not you're doing it correctly, because there's a rhythm. So if you do something incorrectly, you can tell. You don't need to be told by stage management that you missed something, because there is a rhythm to it. It just sticks in your craw better. There's also not a lot of contemporary language has a lot of, like interruption type thing, and that is very difficult to memorize because there's no flow to the thought. In this kind of language, you can really get behind what the thoughts are, and it helps you with the actual words. So way easier, this kind of material.
Right. So we talked a little bit about language, and I think one of the interesting things about when you Moliere, and we have an expert. Corinne is she's a master teacher in a form of theater called Commedia. And we're going to have Corinne talk and do a little display of what Commedia is in just a bit. But Moliere, in terms of his work as an artist, was very influenced by this tradition, originally Italian tradition of Commedia. And his early plays are very much based on stock characters and stock situations. But what happened as he developed as a playwright, he started introducing poetry into the words. So there's this incredible synergy between these characters, these larger than life, often, stereotypical characters, with this magnificent use of language. And that's the thing I think that David Ives has captured in a very palpable way and very accessible to an American audience. You have these larger than life characters, and you have this wonderful, playful use of language. But we talked a little bit about the form. When Molière wrote his plays, he wrote in a certain verse form, and that was actually called iambic hexameter or Alexandrian, which is iamb is a metric foot. Iamb, it's da-dum, and Shakespeare wrote also in da-dum. The difference is with Shakespeare, in each line there's 5 iambic feet, for a total of 10 syllables. And Molière wrote with 6 iambic feet for 12 syllables. And both Richard Wilbur and David Ives realized that to people who are used to Shakespeare, English-speaking people, that extra syllable, that extra da-dum, seems jarring, right? So if you notice in this play, he kept the iambic pentameter. So that's what Shakespeare wrote in. Like, if music be the food of love, play on, Twelfth Night. So he kept the iambic pentameter, but with these, or he used what Richard Wilbur used, and the rhyming couplets, and I think it's that juxtaposition. And I think, too, the rhymes help you learn the lines. Wow. So it's not only the verse, it's not only da-dum, 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 but you also know that there's a rhyme at the end. Did you find when you were working on the text that the form, the iambic came naturally to you? Because a lot of you have done a great deal of Shakespeare. So did that feel natural?
I've heard it said a couple times that one of the reasons that Shakespeare chose to write in iambic pentameter is it's the rhythm of our heart. And it's a very natural, easy way. And if you aren't paying attention, it tends to be the way we naturally speak. It's just kind of an ease and a flow. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? As a French speaker, do you feel like that? Because I've also heard tell that that's a very natural form for English. Do you feel like the Alexandrian is a more natural form for how French works linguistically?
Yeah, I want to say, so I actually also, besides studying acting in the US, I studied in France, and I remember that my teacher in France, who was very high on French,
What a surprise.
said that French was the most beautiful language in the world because it flowed like a river. And the way Alexandrian works is, I'm going to say a line from Racine in French. So, prêtez-moi l'un et l'autre une oreille prêtez-moi l'un et l'autre une oreille attentive. So it flows and then hits the last word in the line, which doesn't really work. And we hit operative words, and we have a totally different rhythm. So I think it's actually really important that we translate the Alexandrian into iambic pentameter, because I don't think if we said, now is the winter of our discontent, that wouldn't really work. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
So at this point, I think it would be really great, sort of a segue, to talk a little bit about Commedia. Are you willing to do that?
I'm willing, yes.
So yeah,
I'm going to stand up to do this.
you can actually even, you want some
I'm going to
space?
take out my masks.
Are you going to demonstrate?
I'm going to demonstrate.
Here you go,
I'm
right
gonna
here.
demonstrate, but
Here.
I'll do that at the end. Okay. So I'll use the microphone. So John asked me to talk a little bit about the relationship between Commedia dell'arte and Molière. And for those of you who don't know, Commedia was a form of Italian theater. It had its heyday in the 1500s and 1600s. And it was a professional theater, it was a popular theater, and it was characterized by traveling troupes of players who performed around Europe, were extremely popular in France, and they worked with masks. And the masks represented what John referred to as stock characters or archetypical characters that were recognized in their culture and are actually quite universal, and we still have them today. The father of a family, the young lovers, the pedantic doctor, a braggart captain, a mischievous servant, and so these traveling troupes were incredibly popular in Paris, and they even settled there, and some actors would play one mask for their entire career. And also, one really great thing about Commedia is that it was the first theater that had women on stage as actors. They didn't always wear masks. Some of the characters were not masked. Molière saw the Commedia, and he was a great admirer of the Commedia, and he was highly influenced, as were quite a few playwrights, Corneille, Marivaux in the 18th century, and all throughout theater history. So he, in his early plays, especially his one acts, he's highly influenced directly by the style, the kinds of stories in Commedia, and the same kinds of characters. As he progressed as a playwright, he got more sophisticated, and his plays were still influenced by Commedia, by large archetypical characters. They became more satirical. He mocked society. He was very political. He was very controversial in his time. He had a company that, like the Commedia, traveled around France, the provinces, for 12 years. It was called l'Illustre Théâtre. And then they came back to Paris, and they settled there and were the king's players. Most of Moliere's plays have a central male figure, and this male figure is usually the father of the family, and he usually has an obsession. And this obsession makes him a very bad head of household, or a bad leader, or as my dad said, a pseudo-alpha chicken. So someone in a leadership position, but who creates chaos. We know nothing about that. So say, for example, Harpagon in The Miser is obsessed with money. Argan in The Imaginary Invalid is a hypochondriac, so he's obsessed with doctors. In The Would-Be Gentleman, the father is obsessed with status. In Tartuffe, the father is obsessed with a religious zealot who's actually a con artist. And this creates the conflict in the play, and things fall apart. For example, the daughter cannot marry the person that she loves because the father wants her to marry a doctor or a rich person or marry the religious zealot. In our play, the central male figure, and we also have a central female figure, is obsessed with truth-telling. And so you said something great, he blows through and creates chaos because of that. So I'm going to show you some of these masks, which I have from the Commedia, and I teach with these masks. I'm going to be teaching a workshop here on October 21st in mask, but maybe some of them you'll recognize. So this is probably the most famous Commedia character. He's called Arlecchino, or Arlequin, or Harlequin. Arlecchino is a mischievous servant type. He's always hungry. He's always looking to make a buck. He usually has, you can see this red bump on his head, which may symbolize that he bumps his head a lot because he's not very focused. Or his other part of his personality is he has a little bit of the devil in him, so it's a little bit of a devil's horn. And in our play, we have a character who I think we could say might be based on Arlecchino, who's not here today, but Basque. It's a servant, who's actually two servants played by the same actor. And you'll understand why when you see. So, okay. So this one is also well known. This is the captain. The captain is a braggart. He often is played as a Spaniard named Matamore, and he will always brag about how many people he's killed in battle, but he's really a coward inside. So when push comes to shove, he runs. And I think this character is very much like Sean's character, his fop character. Sean plays Oronte, and that character he's not a military person, he's a poet. And he's extremely proud of his poetry, and he challenges Frank, / assessed by saying he can take any criticism, and when he recites his poetry, he's roundly criticized and he completely falls apart. So, so I think it's very much this personality. He also has a little bit of the doctor character in him, who's a pedant, who goes on, so proud of his knowledge, it doesn't necessarily make any sense. So this character, I think, this is Tartaglia, and I think is very much Patrick's fop character, Acast. Tartaglia, as you can see by the face, is very sort of sad, a little bit of a sad sack. He's a little bit slow, as Acast is. He's, as he says, stupid, even though we're not supposed to say that. Only he can say that. And he has, traditionally, this mask the character has trouble speaking. And Acast has a little bit of a lisp, and he has trouble coming up with words. So that's this mask. And I brought a couple of other ones that, this one is you can tell that it has to be a female, or, and when I teach with this, the guys can try this mask as well, because with mask, we're really looking to be able to transform. So we transform our voices and our bodies to create characters so that we're unrecognizable. And when you see our play, you'll see that we all transform into these wild characters. And our masks are really our wigs and our costumes and our makeup and our bodies and our voices. This one is also quite specific, but I've had many female students work with this one to try to create whatever this might be. And what is it? Oh, this is Brighella. And Brighella is actually a servant character, but very different from Arlecchino. Brighella is more of a con artist. I like to say that he'll offer to carry your bags, but then he'll leave with them. And I thought the face of this one is very much like my character Arsinoe, even though the personality traits aren't necessarily. And so I'm going to demonstrate with this mask. I like to demonstrate with this mask because it requires me to transform the most. This mask is called Pantalone, and Pantalone is the father of the family. He tends to be a miser, and a lot of the humor comes from the fact that he still has a very strong sex drive, and he tends to fall in love with young women. So I'm going to do this without a microphone, if that's okay.
Sadness, And the mask helps us to do that. It forces us to use our bodies. And then we can also express love. Anger, etc. We try to stay very connected with the audience in Commedia. We have a direct connection, looking straight at you. The mask lives the strongest when the face is forward. So, I'm gonna go now. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much for that. It's, you can tell how useful that is, not only if you're doing a Commedia piece, but in terms of training an actor and how it forces you to use your body and voice in imaginative ways and ways to create character. So I think we have a little bit of a snippet, and I don't think anyone has seen this yet, of the show that we're going to share with you before we take questions.
May I have your attention for a minute?
My name is Dio. I'm so freaking cool. Sorry, I'm wet. I just came from the pool. Yeah, daily rounds, 6 hours of Pilates, the jog, the weights, picked up a couple hotties.
You think of me, I'm newest friend. He's late, but that's his talent.
A friend of yours, monsieur?
A Frenchman born, Frank's been some years in Britain, where he's picked up I swear, it's not a front, a preternatural gift for being blunt.
Will you excuse me, please? I'm being furious!
Call him opinionated, cranky, tart. He's turned his testiness into an art. I find it fun.
That's what's so odd.
Poor silly man, my dear, you look so shaken. Why shouldn't you be? Your darling Frank is taken.
I am?
Now you have me, you'll never pine.
Excuse me, madam, but this man is mine.
Yours?
This is my property on which you're treading, but I'll be sure to ask you to the wedding.
Wait.
I love it. All of you are watching that like, huh? And we're all like, this is great!
Oh, you missed the tag. Anyway, as you can tell, it's a wild ride. And I think right now we can use a little laughter in our lives. So please join us for the production. We'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
I'd like to know where all these people came from.
Oh, excellent question.
I live in New York City for the last 20 years, but I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland.
I am based out of New York as well, but I'm from Poughkeepsie originally, which is in the Hudson Valley.
Originally from Phoenix, Arizona, but now I live in Brooklyn.
I live in New York. I was actually born in France, but I grew up mostly in the Northeast.
And I also live in New York, but I was born and raised in Las Vegas and fled.
I was just wondering if this could be a drawing room in the White House in 2017.
Do you want to talk about that, Gio?
While we did not use the White House for any of our scenic inspiration, it's very funny. It's certainly a stately room, and I think it is meant exactly to...
It is oval.
It is oval. That is, well, we did do that. And we did choose a stately drawing room, and we did try, it is meant to convey a place of high power. So.
And there's lots of preposterous hair also.
Subtle. Smooth. Slid right in there.
That's thanks.
I'm particularly taken with the archetypal masks. What is the significance of their being red?
Well, I think this one is the red one that I have. I think this is a very angry character, so I think that might be why this one is red. Yeah.
They all seem red, though.
At a distance.
They're leather, right? They're made out of leather.
They're made of leather. I think that some of them had traditional colors, like the doctor was a black mask and Arlecchino was as well, but I think this pops more on stage, and this one is red as well, yeah, and I think this one is also a very fiery character, so that would maybe be why it would be red.
How about the age of the audience? Children, bringing children?
Well, here's, we have been,
PG-13?
We've been pretty clear that it's naughty in body, but I have to say that while I imagine some people, may not find some parts particularly to their liking, it's much milder than what you'd see on television.
We had a group of those were high school students, right? They came to our first preview and they
Loved it.
Loved it.
Yep.
So I think it would be well, I'm not a parent, but
we also had a very young girl come yesterday, and I was a little nervous about her being there, but she has been going to the theater all her life, so she has a very open mind, and I think part of it is what conversations are you comfortable having with whoever you bring on the backside, because there is sexual content. Some of the more naughtier verbal sexual innuendo would go over somebody's head if they were very young. Teenagers will get it all. But as you saw, there's also, there is sexual advances, and it's fun. It's all in good humor. But yeah, you'd have to be aware that you might need to answer some questions.
It's kind of a slippery slope in terms of recommendation. So I like to take the stance that you give people an idea of what the content is, and then the parent should decide whether it's right for the kid or not. I don't feel like I'm in a position to decide what's right for somebody else's kid. But maybe my threshold is pretty high, but compared to some of the things I see on television, it's nothing.
Have any of you acted in plays together before or known each other before, or are you all strangers?
Patrick and I have done a production of the Misanthrope together, oddly. And I've known, technically, Corinne for like 20 years. She was in graduate school at the University of Delaware when I was an undergrad, so we have a lot of friends in common. We've never worked together, but we've known each other for a long time.
What's each of your previous connections with the Rep?
I have none.
This is my fourth time here at the Rep. I did the complete works of William Shakespeare abridged. I did the 25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee and Peter and the Starcatcher. So, yeah, 4 unique but equally wonderful things here.
I have no connection with the Rep. I was in Little Rock about 15 years ago doing a show at the Robinson Center for a couple weeks, but no connection, no prior connection to the Rep.
This is my first time in Arkansas, and I'm delighted. John and I did a play together in 2000. Okay, I won't say. A long time ago. with a company called the Acting Company. It was called Murder by Post, so I've been directed by him before. Yeah.
I'm new to Little Rock, so this is my first time here and first time at the Rep.
I should say my wife is a graduate of the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, so I have a little bit of Arkansas connection, but this is my first time in Little Rock. Little pigs here. It's grim this year, right?
Well, thank you so much. Oh, yes, one more?
Wigs are in the show. Do you have any idea?
10. There's 10 wigs. Everyone's wigged and one person has 2 wigs because he plays 2 characters.
And they're
And the queen has a
outrageous.
wig. There's 11 wigs.
Wigs are, they're extraordinary too.
They were created for this production by an artist out of New York who we hired to do the wigs because they are. It's one of the interesting things about doing period pieces. As an actor, I remember when I was an actor, once you put on those clothes and the makeup and the hair, it really informs how you move through the world, how you interact with each other. I mean, one of the funny things was Kareen's wig is really pretty outrageous, and it adds about how many feet to either side of you.
Definitely a foot on either side.
So going through a doorway is an entirely different experience when you have 2 feet of hair on either side of you. So, but the wigs are just really fun and amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Come see the show.